Hello and welcome to today's webinar, From Basics to Best Practices, Building Your Client-Side Data Infrastructure. I'm Jake Spencer, a Product Marketing Manager at Telium, and I'll be your moderator this morning. So let's move on to today's speaker. Today's speaker is Jamie Wells. You may recognize him from our last webinar, the role of server-side in the future of your data foundation. Jamie is returning to speak with us today on the client side. And a little bit about Jamie quickly. Jamie Wells is the U.S. West Manager of Solutions Consulting at Telium. He started his SaaS career, like many others, by offering to lend a helping hand to a friend's small business. He was hired to build an e-commerce website from scratch in 2005 to serve as an outlet for selling overstock of in-store merchandise. Upon completion of that project, he began an 8-year run at the Active Network, managing implementation and customer success for the sports and endurance registration business. Jamie then transitioned from online payment and registration databases into the world of digital analytics and marketing technology by beginning his career at Telium in 2014 as a solutions consultant. Jamie continues to work for Telium in that field, enabling and scoping digital transformation and analytics projects for Telium's enterprise customer. We're super excited to have Jamie with us this morning. Jamie, I will kick it over to you to run through the agenda and the content.
Thank you, Jake. Thanks for that intro. So I'm Jamie. It's nice to be here. So we're going to take you through first just some concepts associated with client-side instrumentation of tagging and vendor management for measurement, analytics, and so on. We're going to talk through some models associated with client-side collection and management. So there are a few different ways that you can tackle this challenge and task, and we'll explore a few of those. Talk through some considerations associated with each of those models, and really just considerations for in-client measurement and tracking in general, and then talk about some future implications. So the world, especially associated with connected devices and the internet, is changing rapidly. The late 90s, it's always changing rapidly. And what are we doing to really get ahead of some of those changes and make sure that analytics, measurement, marketing departments, business units are set up for success in the future? We'll finish that with some questions. Happy to answer any questions as they come through. As Jake mentioned, he's going to be moderating. So if I don't start to answer your question right away, have no fear, that will be addressed at the end. We're going to leave some time for that. The content should last about 45 minutes or so today. So starting with concepts, let's just make sure that everybody is kind of on the same page in terms of when we talk about client-side tracking and client-side tag management, what is it that we really mean? So if you look at this graphic and you can see, we have web browser, whether that's mobile web or traditional desktop web browsers on the left and in the center. And then we have IoT on the right, which are really just different platforms for accessing and connecting with any sort of brand or any sort of application within a different medium, so just not using a browser. So those are things like kiosks, or those are things like ATMs or native mobile applications in your Android or your iOS that would be accessed via like your iOS App Store, for example. And we'll explore how those SDKs differ, how those platforms have different languages, but at the end of the day, it really is the same process of in-client instrumentation of tracking and then distribution of that information to various endpoints. And so we can sort of talk through that as we go throughout this webinar. So if we look at those little icons there, those are tags, right? So those represent in-client instrumentation. And you'll notice in the browser, there are a lot more of them. And that's typical. That's simply because those in-client, the browser as a medium allows for sort of a lot wider array of data distribution direct from the browser, which when we talk about, client side from a distribution perspective, that's what we mean. So what is tag management? If you know you have to do this, and frankly, people have been doing this since the age of, click tracking on native banners in the mid-90s, what is that? What are we talking about? So a tag is typically referred to, especially within the Telium nomenclature or just within the digital marketing technology nomenclature, as a snippet of code that is placed within an application that essentially tracks the behavior of interaction with that particular page or that particular button. It's typically vendor specific, meaning each vendor is going to give you a whole sort of set of tags, and then you have to place those responsibly within any application you want. So in this particular case, we're looking at a web page, and you can see the multiple tags are kind of there in the middle, along with and sitting alongside all the images and all the styling and all of the text and so on that gets delivered to that particular web page. So tag management is really the addition of a universal mechanism through which you can manage all of that instrumentation through an admin console, through a UI. So it simplifies the implementation process, and it allows you to kind of create this data dictionary, if you will, so that all of your different vendors that are collecting information from a client application are all doing so from the framework of sort of the same language or the same terms. And then, as we expand this into client applications that are a little more locked down, something like an iOS App Store or an Android Play environment, we start to talk about different mechanisms for getting data out of and into the client. So that's that last bullet, which would be like a WebKit or a web view instantiated inside of a native application, or this notion of remote commands or external configuration for something that is natively coded. And that gets a little bit more into the weeds. We will try to stay a little higher level than that, but it's still an interesting sort of future concept as related to tag management. So why did tag management come to bear? Really, it was this notion of, just like kind of countless other things like content management systems, it's this idea that business users and strategists and people in charge of measurement and analytics and new marketing technologies such as chat or reviews or landing page management, they would rather use a UI than look at code and do this just by coding in a terminal. So where things were traditionally coded direct into a file, and then that file was uploaded to a web server, and this whole thing was managed by dev and IT, people that were fairly far removed from all of the actual analytics and reporting and responsibilities to the business owners, that was a bridge too far in a sense. So what this tag management application allowed you to do is really just put a UI on all of that tracking code and allow users that aren't really familiar with the native JavaScript that's required to actually manage this stuff. And it really opened the door to freeing up IT resources, but also empowering teams that were more on the analytics and measurement and marketing sides of the house to really take control of the data that's being gleaned from all of their client applications, including web properties. So what did this create? This created actually a better level of collaboration instead of sort of menial or just sort of repetitive tasks that the marketing teams were constantly asking the IT teams to perform. Can you add a new button here? Can you add new tracking or a new tracking value for this page here? Can you add a new vendor into this page because we switched retargeting platforms? Those sorts of tasks were eliminated from the IT world, and so now when the marketing team came to the IT team, it was much more sort of strategic in saying we need enhancements to native functionality associated with our business versus these sort of task management that had been happening before. So it really did help in terms of relations between those two teams. So why did it help? Well, previous to something being in the client and managing the data gleaned from a client application, like a web browser, there was a bit of chaos. Teams would, code in JavaScript variables specifically for the new implementation that occurred for that new vendor. So if you think about this notion of, the reviews engine on the website, as well as the chat service, as well as the confirmation page attribution vendors, they all sort of need to know, the name of the page and the order ID, and they all need to know the product ID and the product details. And those things were being gleaned from the web page using different functions. And that created chaos. It created inconsistent data sets going to these various, technologies and measurement tools, which created confusion from the ultimate, executives, for example, that are reading dashboards that have numbers that are off or that have terms and nomenclature that aren't consistent. And therefore, it became confusing and frankly, untrustworthy data. So what we strive to do is provide a layer of information that is consistent and distributed to all of the vendors that need to consume it. So it creates a more trustworthy environment. It creates more transparency and less of a black box to those that are actually reviewing the information and looking at it in charts and graphs. And it creates a lot more clarity for the development teams when they actually look at the underlying code. It's a much more cleaner it's a much cleaner just interface to really look at, as opposed to globally scoped JavaScript variables all over the place, which speaking from experience is not really a best practice to perform. So that's really the history and kind of the concepts associated with tag management and really just managing information coming off of the client. Telium has always sort of taken this stance that it's the responsibility of the business, and really it's the responsibility of Telium as a software provider to organize the information in a coherent way from the get-go, from the actual client application, so that the garbage in, garbage out sort of cliche doesn't really come into the vernacular of a particular business. They never need to talk about it because there's never any garbage going in. Now, looking at this so now that we have the concepts down, looking at this from a historical perspective, this all really started around 2005 with double-click container tags in the ad tech business. So at the same time that I was frantically trying to figure out how to associate a payment tech payment system onto a website, there were people out there building these container tags for tracking pixels within ad servers. That's kind of how it started. And then it quickly grew from that to 2000. Actually, there's sort of something in the middle there, which is 2008, 2009, which is where our company actually founded a consulting service that allowed for the migration of big businesses from one major analytics provider to another, which was really the onset of this notion of a data layer, of a sort of central dictionary of terms that are actually just loaded into the client that any vendor can read from and distribute data from. So that sort of happened in 2008. In 2009, a couple companies took that a little bit of a step further, and they developed this client-server hybrid model. Now, the client-server hybrid model was awesome because it allowed for a UI to manage all of that sort of data layer extraction and management of information to be distributed to various vendors. There were some things that were required in that, so why it's a hybrid is because there's like an app server with a rules engine, and you always had to hit that app server and say, hey, app server, what page am I on? Okay, what vendor tags do I load to the page for this one? And there was sort of a constant chatter back and forth between the client and the server to understand, what vendor tags and what stuff to load. So that was a little bit of a con, but still an efficient means to allow for sort of some freedom with respect to remotely managing all of this client tracking. In 2010, Telium, actually along with quite a few others, introduced this notion of purely server to server. So because companies started to complain a little bit about all this, code in the client, and they were saying this is sort of slowing down and bogging down our time to interactive KPIs that we have for our website. Can't we just do this in a model where it's server to server? And so sometimes yes, and then of course sometimes no, because of things like third-party cookies, and you can't really put your reviews engine code in a server-to-server environment because it's literally printing reviews services, for example, like on a web page or a chat vendor or so on and so forth. In 2011, actually, Telium brought our products to market. So like I said, in 2008, for 3 years, helping people construct a coherent data layer for their business. In 2011, we actually wrapped a UI around our purely client-side tag management product. So what that means is all of the tracking is instrumented in the client application, and all of the distribution of the information actually goes out through that client application as well. Requires no pass-through. It's very sort of safe and efficient because it fails elegantly, which is something that is key, right? You always have to have a contingency plan if something does go wrong, and that was really helpful for businesses that were struggling with points of failure. And then you have this notion that everything is sort of occurring in the browser, so you have the entire document object at your disposal to build rules off of, and so on and so forth, and to glean data from. So it really won the day, and you'll see that any of the enterprise tag management systems out there are going to have within their bevy of products or their product line, they're going to have a purely client-side tag management option. So I started to go into this a little bit, but I have a couple of slides here. I have a couple of graphics that make this point around the difference between a client-server hybrid and a purely client-side methodology. And this is all, you'll notice the little graphic there, this is all dedicated and sort of focused on a web browser. So your Chromes, your Mozillas, your Firefox, or your Safaris, etc. That's what we're talking about here in terms of the medium, in terms of the platform for engagement. So you can see there on the left, there's a file server. Obviously, that loads the file that has all the tracking code associated with it. It deploys a few tags, etc. Then there's that app server. So it says, hey, well, actually, it doesn't deploy a few tags because the app server says, hey, what page am I on? What do I need to load to the page? And so there's sort of a round trip there. And then it says, hey, I need to load these things. I need to load analytics, and I need to load a few ad tech measurement, pixels, and so on and so forth. And then that occurs as a user traverses through the website. That occurs on every page that they load, and really, frankly, every button that's tracked as well. There's a constant sort of check. Hey, on this app server, okay, what do the rules say for this? What do the rules say for this page? What do the rules say for this page? And if the rule says load a new tag, then that tag is pulled from the file server and loaded to the web page. And that model worked for a lot of companies, and it was really developed as a way to keep landing pages as light as possible. For example, you don't need to load the rules into the document. You don't need to load all the rules up front. But what it does is it does create this rule request every single time, which does create a point of failure, frankly. So if that app server happens to be down, what happens? Well, nothing loads. Things that are loaded, things could be blockers. Things could block the page from loading. You get the dreaded sort of white screen associated with your web page, and so on and so forth. So this is a model that is quite efficient when it's running and humming, but does have this notion of a sort of single point of failure. So now we introduce client side. So what happens client side is there's sort of an upfront load of all of the universal tag that's sort of there controlling all of the subsequent tags and the rules. So you load all the stuff up into the client, and then the client has that information cached. That's why you see actually no round trip associated with the second, third, and fourth page view or page load as related to this graphic. And you can see here, if the rules state on this fourth page, so if we think of this as a traditional funnel, whether it's like a lead form fill or it's a purchase funnel, if this happens to be, this last icon there happens to be a confirmation page, maybe we do need to load a new tag. So you can see a new tag loaded in green, but that just loads based off of rules that had already been present. They're sort of omnipresent and always cached along with the user's session. Which again, it does sort of eliminate that single point of failure, or at least it eliminates one point of failure, and it also just sort of won the day in terms of efficiency. If you look at the overarching performance of this model actually does result in faster overall experience for the user. And really the reason for this is frankly this notion that all the tags, all the rules load from a content delivery network, as you can see here represented, and then all the data can be distributed directly to the vendor from the client. And you can see whether that's coming by way of a natively installed SDK or that's coming by way of a multiple CDN, right? Whether it's a client application that happens to be a mobile app, or it's a client application that happens to be a web browser. That's just what's represented here in the two different areas running into those applications. So let's talk about a few nuances associated with synchronous versus asynchronous loading. So the best practice associated within the client data distribution is an asynchronous model. What that means is, all the sort of code responsible for performing the tracking in the client executes ASAP. It executes sort of as all of the images are loading and as all of the text and really the interactive components are loading, and then essentially all the data is distributed once all of the interactive components of the page have loaded, and they're doing so immediately upon that. There's no waterfall. So synchronous loading is saying you load 1, you load 2, you load 3, and essentially the third one is going to take, is going to add up the second and first one's time plus whatever time it takes to load. So you ultimately get a sort of slower time to interactive and a slower document complete if you have all of this tracking code loading in a synchronous fashion than if you had it loaded asynchronously. Now this should be nothing new for folks, but it is worth reminding that this is certainly the best way to load, especially behind the scenes, sort of under the hood tracking. It can also absolutely be the best way to load even things like multivariate or A/B content testing tools, things like chat, things like even interactive components, because you just sort of put a placeholder in the default content, and then the page generates, and it doesn't really generate in that sort of old school top-down fashion. It generates the way people are used to, where windows populate with information, and so on and so forth. So that's really something that we strive to do for any vendor that we instrument and integrate with, so that it makes sure that it loads to the page in the most efficient fashion possible. Now we started to talk at least a little bit about conditional loading of particular vendors, in a previous slide, but this sort of takes that and grows it into this notion of efficiency. So if you look at this example, I have a page and then I have a confirmation page, and if I have no conditions or no rules, then the confirmation page might take a little while to load, and I think all of us have noticed that in our lives that, man, getting to checkout, getting to that sort of form fill page is really, really fast, and then I hit confirm or I hit submit or I hit pay now, and then it takes like a little longer for the actual confirmation page to load. Now, some of that's if you're paying somebody and you're doing that transaction, you have to do some verification there. But some of it can be attributed to all those vendors that need to know that I converted as a user. Well, if you look at this in a bit more efficient fashion, you might be able to eliminate some of those vendors from loading if you know up front that they are not needed. They don't need to know about this particular conversion. I'm only going to tell my affiliate tracking vendors that somebody has converted if, in fact, there is an affiliate tracking source associated with my visit or my previous 5 visits. And therefore, I can set rules that say, hey, don't load all of that stuff if it's not necessary, because I know that I've never seen this person from an affiliate marketing website. This is just an example, but it really does start to unlock a lot of possibility for efficiencies. It also, frankly, it makes reporting that gets all the way to the other end much cleaner, because if you're only sending data when you know you need to send it, you don't have the opportunity to, sort of add some fuzziness to the information because of maybe misreporting on the vendor side based on bad data in. So we need a way to get this information to the client very, very, very fast. Right? So historically speaking, we introduced content delivery networks to make images, to cache images on edge nodes, because frankly, images are the thing that slows down, web pages from loading the most. But this notion of a content delivery network was widely and quickly adopted by our industry and by the analytics and tracking industry as a way to get our JavaScript files and our different hosted files for different platforms loaded up into the client application, so into the client side. This started by saying, hey, Akamai, we're going to use you, or Verizon Edgecast, we're going to use you, or Fastly, or Highwinds, or Level 3, or whatever. And then it quickly migrated, especially for Telium, into this notion of, well, hey, you know what? Telium's going to contract with like all of them. We're going to upload our files to any number of CDNs, so that if you happen to be in South Africa or you happen to be in Malaysia, and that there's a CDN there that's faster than the one that's here on the West Coast, like typically when I look at and monitor my own behavior, Edgecast wins the day for my tracking code on the West Coast pretty much all the time. Used to be Akamai, but if I go to Europe, Akamai is going to win, for example. And so we make sure that we have the least amount of resistance possible for loading in all that tracking code by introducing n number of CDNs. And Telium actually allows for our hosting model for any of those CDNs to be awarded business, and we essentially pay them for performance. The more their particular CDN is awarded traffic, the higher our bill is for them, which is kind of a cool way to do it, because it constantly keeps them competing for our business, and it creates a faster user experience for our customers. Not that this is a complete Telium, commercial or anything. But let's take a look at some considerations to that, right? So I've been preaching this notion of client-side tracking is a great thing, but there are some considerations to make with respect to doing all of this in a client application. So the first one is, let's make sure that we compress and bundle as much code as possible onto, in the most efficient way possible when we're loading all of these vendor tag code as well as all of these rules into the page when the user lands on the page. Let's make sure that, in a mobile application, we have modules, and our SDK is modular. So if you don't need the crash handling module, or you don't need the lifecycle module, let's remove that and really make those SDKs that are installed in client applications as lightweight as they possibly can be. For example, on the website side, I mean, if you wanted to strip down our universal tag to its bare bones components, it's all sort of open source, so you could technically do that. On the SDK front, it becomes a little bit harder depending on how things are architected. So if you're using our Swift SDK or our Ruby or our Java SDK, we've constructed these as modules so that you don't need to load the whole thing just to use sort of one fraction of that particular application. That's a key consideration when looking at, how much I'm going to have to actually put into the client application in order to glean the information or distribute the information appropriately. Intelligently caching, so cache busting on all the files. I'll give you a sort of pointed example of this forgive me if it gets a little bit too technical, but essentially what happens when you're working inside of Telium's UI, you have this opportunity to, update the analytics vendor. Maybe you're scoping new information to the analytics vendor. Well, you've got 35 floodlight tags that are out there, and if I hit publish, I don't want to reseed all of those floodlight tags onto the edge nodes of the CDNs, because that's going to require a new sort of download of all of those tags for all the users out there in the world. I want to keep those versions cached as long as possible on those edge nodes so that the user's experience out there in the world is sort of in aggregate as fast as it possibly can be. So we don't update those. If we're updating analytics and we're promoting a new publish, obviously on the back end you have the workflow and the management associated with the fact that there was an update to the client-side application sort of code or the Telium instance, but we don't actually update all of those files because it's unnecessary. So intelligently caching is an absolute, and it's baked into our system. It should be baked into any system that you look at for doing this. Governance. So when you're doing this and you are actually distributing information from a client application directly to some vendor, you better make sure that you have the ability to audit exactly how that data is being collected and exactly when and exactly where. In fact, some of our customers, they do things like vanity URL our files so that all of the files are being served from what look to be their customer domain, and that's something that allows for a little bit more trust with the browser, and it allows for them to sort of have a sense of governance around this. Some vendors who are pretty security conscious will actually iframe in all of the tracking. So if you go to some of our, especially financial services customers, what will happen is you'll see that they're loading in all the tracking code, but they have this post message scenario that's been set up so that they're isolating and sandboxing all of that client application tracking because they don't want anybody to have an opportunity to go rogue. So while you obviously would never happen, it's always a matter of risk mitigation. So people will provide that level of risk mitigation if necessary. And then finally, we talk about in the client, keeping the client application as clean as possible when we talk about native mobile. And native mobile inherently has a lower bandwidth. It has a lower capacity for loading in, tracking modules and so on and so forth, because there's only so much footprint that a user has on their phone when they download an application. But sometimes there are SDKs that just absolutely need to be natively loaded into the page. Something like an ad mob if you're serving ads. Something like Facebook Connect, or like for Instagram, for example, before they were acquired by Facebook, they were using the Facebook Connect SDK so that you could create your account super easy, using Facebook, well, those have to be in the app in order to work. They have proprietary functionality that's native to their own SDK. What Telium can do and what client-side management can do in that native mobile environment is actually quote-unquote wrap their functionality. So really just provide a configuration file for them so you could change things on the fly without actually having a new publish, have it affect change inside of that native SDK that happens to be loaded or subloaded through our system. So without getting too technical, the way that we typically demonstrate this is there's a native app, and the only thing in the native app is a square block that is a color. Let's just say that color is yellow. Well, the code to make that block is natively inside the application. There is a button in Telium that says, hey, here's a color swatch selector, right? And if you change the hexadecimal code from, F0, 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 whatever yellow is, if you change it to all zeros, boom, that square changes to black. And that's kind of the way that, if you want to think about this, that's kind of the way that we're doing it. We're changing the configuration of something that's natively installed, which is a cool way to do it, and kind of referred to in the industry as SDK wrapping, at least recently. Lastly, a consideration that many have been making more recently is this notion of, I want to get out of the client. I want my tracking I want my data distribution specifically to be outside of the client. So while I understand that I have to track all this stuff, like button clicks and page views and conversions and application installs, I want to do that as lightweight as possible, and then I want to kind of distribute the information using a server-to-server model. It's kind of a new agey way to think about the hybrid, right? It's not really the client hybrid we were talking about in terms of tag management. It's a little bit more of a new hybrid model. But the idea is you still need to, in certain circumstances, glean IDs directly, especially in a browser scenario where third-party cookies are still pervasive, right? They're obviously decaying a little bit with the onset of things like ITP, but they're still very pervasive. Like, I use Chrome, I have third-party cookies, I don't care who tracks me. What would happen is I'd need to grab that cookie and then distribute that information on the server side. So this is a consideration for all those different vendors that have traditionally been distributing information purely in the client, purely in the browser. More and more, there's an opportunity to load those not in the browser and load those actually from a server. And actually, if you want to know more about this, Jake had a plug for this State of the Server Side webinar that myself and my boss and mentor here at Telium performed a few weeks back, so please look that up. And then, the next consideration is sort of on that same topic, or that same sort of rationale, is native mobile, or really just IoT in general. And when we perform that task in the client purely, when we have that hybrid model like I just described, and when we have really only, on the far right there, you see there's really only one native client application tracking code installed. So like one SDK is actually in the app performing client-side tracking, and all of that is offloaded into a server. So there's always going to be sort of this spectrum, right? And in certain cases, you might be all the way on the right, and you might say, I have the lightest footprint you could possibly imagine within the native application. I have one set of tracking code. I offload all that stuff onto the server, and then the server does all the distribution. More often, though, than not, like especially with examples like that Facebook SDK performing the user creation, the ad mob thing, actually serving ads. If you're like in Spotify and you look and you've got ads, right? That's going to always be natively installed. So more often than not, you find yourself somewhere in the middle on that spectrum, where there's a hybrid going on between client-side instrumentation and client-side distribution in concert with gleaning information and distributing that information from a server. Now, I mentioned ITP, so let's quickly sort of address this. I wouldn't call it an elephant in the room, but it's just like a hot topic. So, a lot of this a lot of all of what we're talking about, this client-side instrumentation of all this tracking, really it's done for analytics teams and measurement teams and marketing teams to understand whether their campaigns are working or not working, or how many what different modules are working or not working within these applications. And if you can't understand a user over time, even anonymous users, it becomes more difficult to actually understand the user and the behavior and understand what's working and what's not working. And we've seen this 7-day cap on first-party cookies in Safari. We've seen this notion of vendors that had traditionally operated in the third-party cookie space, such as Google and Facebook, migrating all of their stuff into the first-party space because 7 days is better than 0. And we've seen even DSPs out there, knocking on the door of their customers saying, hey, how about a vanity URL? How about actually, clearing that vanity URL with the Google network for third-party tracking? And how about setting a cookie on the server side and setting a cookie in the HTTP space as a secure cookie, because those haven't been affected by ITP. Really, they just haven't been affected yet, because that's where we see people migrating and saying, hey, let's set the cookie on the server. Let's not set the cookie with JavaScript. And so at least our first-party traffic we can understand over time. And all of this even gets even further sort of shrunken down when you have link decoration. So those things like, this morning I actually clicked on a link from an email from dig.com, which I don't know if anybody remembers Dig. They used to be a thing, and they've sort of lost favor to something like Reddit. But quick story on that. I clicked the link. The link is actually has UTM parameters on it, right? It has tracking parameters. The Dig folks want to know that link came from an email. Well, what ends up happening there is now the cookie is shrunk down to 24-hour cap. So any client-side set cookies are 24 hours, which becomes even more of a challenge. So these are, again, more considerations. Telium and other folks are thinking about the ways that mitigate the effect of this and allow for companies to still have the necessary tracking to tailor experiences and personalize experiences for users, as well as measure performance of campaigns. The other key consideration is GDPR. And if we look at GDPR, and really we're a year and a half into it being a thing, how can we help? How are we helping? Well, we are still, fielding lots of requests for any ongoing help with respect to, again, just risk mitigation. So when Telium is the actual company that is, the UI and the console is the thing that is instrumenting and actually loading all of the trackers onto the client, we put ourselves in a very unique spot, right? Because we are now able to build a feature within our platform that allows essentially the user within from like a modal or a dialog box on the page, as I'm sure you've seen all these like cookie consent, banners. Telium will power that, and essentially the user is just creating the rules. They're just creating the conditions through which that vendor code actually loads. And we've built a whole, feature and UI around this notion of handling, monitoring, logging, consent associated with GDPR. Now we do things in addition to that associated with like something like right to be forgotten or show me what you know about me. But really the client side component is focused around this notion of upfront consent in the client before we send anything anywhere. And if we are the tool that is powering that, it's just a nice, easy transition for us to also be the tool that helps with monitoring, gathering, and governing consent for that tracking to load in the first place. So, this is a little in conclusion, but this graphic kind of sums up what I've been talking about. The left is the client side, if you think about it. The left is the collection in the client side, and that's where Telium has all these sort of libraries that folks can install directly in clients and then glean data. From that point forward, standardize, enrich, integrate, activate, that's where we could do this on the server side. We could do this in the client, but these are the functions that sort of the rest of the Telium service is going to provide for our customers. So, Jake, I will turn it back to you and have you go over what the product manager or the product marketing team offers for resources and any sort of Q&A that occurred during the time. And thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. We appreciate your time. Thanks for walking us through the content today. As a quick note before we get into additional resources, we are going to be doing Q&A with Jamie, so if you have questions, please get them in. There should be a little button on your BrightTalk platform that says Ask a Question. We'll be able to take those live, as many as we can within our time frame. So really quickly, we've had 2 sessions now, one webinar covering server-side, one webinar on covering client-side considerations and setting up your data. Additional resources within Telium that help you walk through those considerations, and you'll find those in the attachment section. And so it'll talk through what we consider as an event data framework, right, which is the combination of server-side and client-side tracking. You'll be able to go through, and there's a data sheet that's really, really in-depth on, what scenarios do you want to choose client-side for? What scenarios might you want to choose server-side for? And so a couple of resources are going to be available to you there on Telium.com, but you need not search for them. They should be right there for you in the attachment section to click directly into them. And so look out for those. And one thing Jamie mentioned was this previous webinar that he and Chris Slovak did on the state of server-side. So you can find that it is the first video in our video hub on Telium.com. So if you go to Telium.com, you go to the resource drop-down menu, go into Video Hub, you should see this State of Server-Side webinar. It's really good. It's an in-depth coverage, much like we did on the client side today, considerations, history, what's the future look like, as on the server side, same scenario. And so it should give you a comprehensive view there, and that's one definitely to watch, as Jamie mentioned. So, Jamie, we've got some questions and wanted to go through some Q&A. Anybody who would like to get in their questions at this time, again, ask a question. But first question, Jamie, what differentiates an enterprise solution for tag management or client-side data collection from like a free option? What are kind of the levels of differentiation there?
Yeah, I've never gotten that question. So that comes up a lot, obviously. I mean, I think first and foremost, it's a notion of documented best practices and support is just going to be one of those things that goes without saying, but also is really helpful. There's of course a lot of overlap. There's a lot of sort of flattery with respect to copying functionality that Telium has introduced and pioneered, and then that showing up in free tools, which we see a lot. So the thought leadership component is also a nice one. Also maturity of the application. Like if we introduce workflow and development environments, for example, in 2015, and those come out in 2017 or 18 within a free tool, you can imagine we've had 2 years to sort of iterate, polish, and perfect those tools based on customer feedback versus an enterprise or versus a free tool that introduced it more recently. The other part is, for me anyway, it's this notion of sort of the little things, right? Like Telium has view-through tracking baked into the platform and a view-through tracking pixel that sort of comes with the tag management system. We have self-hosting options. We have checksum values and sub-resource identity checking, sort of baked into the platform. APIs we have that, support the UI. There's a lot of little features in there that, enterprises are going to need that really they have to sort of self-create when plugging in a tool that is more sort of free or, it's kind of the difference between like open source versus buying something off the shelf when you're in like AWS.
Gotcha. Two questions, one that I'll start with, and then maybe the next question is probably a little bit of a follow-on on that. But two things that you mentioned today, server-side tracking and then third-party cookies becoming more and more limited as more browsers take an approach to privacy restrictions and things like that. Do you see, Jamie, more data being collected on the server side over time as more third-party cookies are becoming limited?
I mean, yeah, we see it already, right? Like there's more and more companies are expanding their API opportunity or their API integrations to handle the same sort of volume and throughput that has been traditionally gleaned from pixels. So instead of a pixel, it's an endpoint, and instead of it being sort of collected and batched and parsed from the pixel, you're getting more of these API-driven, like webhook-driven transfer protocols, and it's just going to continue to evolve. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with web browsers. Obviously, web anytime soon, but we've seen these clips that have happened sort of throughout the past couple of years. There's the advent of ad blockers and ad blockers being very popular to install as extensions in a browser. And that was sort of a cliff drop that people saw. And then that sort of leveled out, and now we're starting to see, the browser itself blocking some of this stuff from loading. And that's another cliff. And so those things are going to inspire change and drive innovation within our industry. And I think, less and less footprint of at least distribution associated with in the client instrumentation is just going to be the norm.
And a follow-on question, and this will be our last one that we'll be able to take. Tag management, client-side data collection overall, in an increasingly, data privacy first landscape, where does tag management fit in? What is it assisting enterprises and organizations to do to be more data privacy focused and conscious?
Yeah, well, in addition to the consent gathering for GDPR, and as those regulations become more widespread and consent needs to be sort of considered, there's also just auditability of the data transfer and the data that's being gleaned by these vendors. One of the biggest features of our platform that people take advantage of, version control and export of version control, to say, hey, my auditor needs an output file or a spreadsheet that shows the data mappings to all my different vendors and exactly what data is being sent where. And if you don't have that, Telium is just like click a button and it's there. But if you didn't have a super sort of organized client-side footprint of collection and distribution, or at least collection, what's going to happen is that's just going to be a bigger task to maintain something like that for people that are auditing what information is being distributed where. That's really the biggest thing that we see in terms of this whole privacy is our customers are seeking much more clarity around exactly what information is being shotgunned out from their client applications than ever before. And we give them a tool to have a view into that.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much. And to those who were able to join us today, thank you as well. We appreciate your time this morning.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.